Clara Bennett drove her knife into the fence post and left it there, shaking, because if she held it one more second she was going to do something she could never take back. The man in the dirt at her boots was still breathing. Barely, shirt soaked black with blood, eyes half open. One hand stretched towards something he couldn't reach. She should have ridden for town. Her father had been telling her since she was 8 years old exactly what to do if she ever found a Hawthorne man on Bennett land. She dropped to her knees anyway. If you've ever chosen compassion when fear told you to walk away, this story was made for you. Subscribe to our channel, ring that notification bell, and stay with Clara's story all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go back to where it all began. The summer of 1876 came to the Powder River Valley, the way all hard things came quiet at first. Then all at once, Clara Bennett had been awake since before sunrise. Same as every morning, because the ranch didn't hold itself together out of sentiment, and neither did she. Her father had ridden south toward Laramie 3 days prior, and the list of work he'd left behind him was long enough to keep 2 men busy. Clara was not 2 men, she was one woman, 26 years old. And she'd been running this place alone long enough that the fact of it no longer felt remarkable. She'd taken the east fence line that morning because 2 posts had gone soft after the spring rains, and she'd been putting off the repair long enough that she could hear her father's voice in her head about it. She loaded the tools herself, saddled her mare herself, rode out in the gray pre-dawn light with a thermos of black coffee wedged in her saddlebag and the work already mapped in her mind. She found the horse first. It was standing absolutely still about 30 yards off the trailhead low. Reins trailing in the dry grass, not grazing, not moving. Just standing, the way horses stood when something had gone terribly wrong and they didn't know what else to do. Clara pulled her mare up and sat very still and looked at that horse for a long moment. Then her stomach dropped and she moved. She found him in the grass on the near side of the fence, half swallowed by the dry summer weeds that had grown up along the old post line. Face down, one arm stretched forward, like he'd been crawling and hadn't made it. His shirt was dark with dried blood across the left shoulder and down his back. He'd been there a while, long enough for the morning to find him. Long enough for things to get serious. Clara dropped off her mare before the animal had fully stopped. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. Her mother had taught her that Margaret Bennett, who had kept a medicine box under the kitchen counter and had believed firmly that a woman who didn't know how to handle an emergency was a woman waiting to become a casualty of one. He had a pulse, thin, fast. But there, she grabbed his right shoulder and shook it. Can you hear me? A sound, not words. The sound of a person holding onto consciousness the way you hold onto the edge of something when the drop below you is very far. I'm going to turn you over, Clara said. It's going to hurt. I'm sorry, she rolled him. He was young. That was the first thing. Younger than she'd expected from the way he'd been lying, dark hair plastered flat with dried sweat. Jaw unshaved for the better part of a week, the kind of face that belonged to a man who lived most of his life outdoors. The wound was high in his left shoulder. Something had gone through clean and come back out, and whoever had packed it in the field had done it badly. The cloth was filthy and soaked, and she could smell the infection already working underneath. This is no one. To herself, his eyes opened. Gray, storm gray, the kind that had more underneath it than it showed. He looked at her without recognition, without fear, without anything that resembled clear thought, fever. She could feel the heat coming off him from 6 inches away. My horse, he said. His voice was barely there. Don't let anything happen to my horse, that was all. His eyes closed. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at him. Then she looked up at the riderless horse, which had walked closer while she wasn't paying attention, and was now standing a few feet off, watching her with large, patient eyes. All right, she said. Both of you, then. Getting him onto her mare was the hardest physical thing she'd done since the winter 2 years ago, when she'd had to restring 100 yards of fence wire alone in the dark during a storm. He wasn't a small man, and he was dead weight by the time she got him upright. And there was a moment long, breathless, her legs shaking, and her jaw locked where she was holding his full weight against her chest, with no help coming from any direction. She got him up. She always got things done. That was the only inheritance Thomas Bennett had given her that she didn't question. The abandoned Pulver cabin sat a quarter-mile west of the fence line, on land nobody had properly claimed since old Silas Pulver died without heirs 6 years back. Clara had used it twice before. It had a roof, a fireplace, 4 walls and a door that latched from inside. For right now, that was sufficient. She got the fire going first, boiled the cleanest water she had, tore strips from the spare shirt she kept rolled behind her saddle, her mother's habit, carried forward. She cleaned the wound the way Margaret had taught her. Thorough and without flinching, because flinching didn't help anyone, and the infection was already inside, and every minute she hesitated was a minute it had to go deeper. He came in and out while she worked. Once he grabbed her wrist, not hard, but sudden, and his eyes came open with something close to clarity. "Who are you?" he said. "Someone who found you in the grass," Clara said. "Hold still. Where's your horse? Is outside." "She's fine. She has water and she can graze." Now Hold stirched her face. Then his hand fell away and he went back under. Clara exhaled through her nose and kept working. The storm she'd watched building all morning hit just before dark, sudden and total. The way Wyoming storms had no patience for gradual. Wind first, then the sky going from orange to a solid wall of gray-black. Then rain in sheets. Lightning walked the far ridgeline. The cabin shuddered. Clara sat beside the fire with her rifle across her knees, and she listened to the storm, and she watched the stranger breathe, and she told herself she was doing what any decent person would do, and that it had nothing to do with the fact that she was lonely in a way she'd stopped admitting to herself years ago. She checked on the horses twice, running through the rain to the lean-to on the south side of the cabin where she'd tied both animals. The stranger's horse, a dark bay mare, accepted her hands without fuss, nuzzled her shoulder on the second visit. Clara stood in the rain with her hand on the animal's neck for a moment longer than she needed to. It was on that second trip, lantern held low, that she saw the saddle. She'd slung it over the lean-to rail earlier, without looking. She'd been in a hurry. Now the lantern light caught the tooled leather, and she saw the brand burned into the skirt of the saddle, and every muscle in her body went absolutely still. A black eagle above a broken star, she knew that mark. She had known it her entire life, the way you know the shape of a scar you've been seeing since you were a child. Her father had described it so many times, and with such particular weight in his voice, not just anger, but the kind of grief that had curdled into something harder, that she could have drawn it in the dirt from memory, without hesitating. The Hawthorne brand. The rain came down around her. The mare shifted. The lantern swung. Clara stood in the dark with the storm roaring and the fire in the cabin, inch orange, through the single small window. And into that cabin, on her bedroll, lay the man she had pulled from the grass and cleaned and covered and spent the last 8 hours keeping alive. She thought about her father's face, the way it closed when that name came up. The way 20 years of grief could hollow a man out and fill the empty space with something that looked like certainty but was really just pain that had learned to stand upright. She picked up the lantern. She went back inside. She stood in the doorway and looked at the man lying in her firelight, and she made a choice that she understood. Even then, was the kind of choice that doesn't unhappen. She set the rifle against the wall. She sat back down. He was better by midnight. She could hear it in his breathing, the horrible labor of it easing slightly, the body finding a little more room to work with. She let herself sleep just before dawn, propped against the wall with her jacket pulled over her, and one ear always half open for the change that would mean she needed to move fast. She woke to gray morning light and the sound of quieter rain and the man across the fire, watching her with clear eyes. "You stayed," he said. "I did," Clara said. "You didn't have to." "No," she said. "I didn't." He tried to push himself upright, partway before the color drained clean out of his face. "Don't," Clara said. "I'm all right. You ain't all right. You've got infection in that shoulder, and you've been unconscious better part of 14 hours. You tear it open trying to prove something, you're going to be in a considerably worse place than you're in now." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted like a man who wasn't accustomed to being spoken to that directly and wasn't sure yet whether he minded it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "When did it happen?" Clara asked. She was already moving to check the wound. 2 days ago. Maybe 3. His jaw tightened while she worked. "Lost track who did it. Men I owe a debt to. That ain't an answer. It's the only one I've got." Clara sat back. "Your horse is fine," she said. "Good animal." His whole face changed at that. The carefulness in it dropped away for just a moment, and he looked younger and unguarded, and she caught a glimpse of who he might be when he wasn't braced against something. "Thank you," he said. "That means thank you. What's her name?" "Dove. She let me rope her without a fuss. Came right into the lean-to. She trusts people easier than she ought to," he said. "Maybe she's a good judge of character." He looked at her, then really looked, slow and careful, the way a man looks when he's trying to figure out whether a thing is safe. "Maybe," he said. Clara set food within his reach. Hardtack and dried meat that had been meant for her own lunch the day before. "Eat what you can," she said. "You need something in you before the fever comes back up." "It's going to come back up? Infection like that?" "In this heat, yes it is. And we're going to fight it when it does." He was quiet for a moment. "Then why are you doing this?" No angle in the question. No manipulation she could find. Just a man who genuinely did not understand why a stranger had pulled him out of the grass and stayed. Clara looked at him straight. "Because you were bleeding beside my fence," she said. "And leaving a man to die beside your fence is not something you walk away from and still know who you are." "What's your name?" he said. And here it was. The moment she'd been circling since the lantern light in the rain. She had a choice. Give her full name and watch the recognition detonate behind his eyes. Find out right now what kind of man he was when he'd been found out, or wait. Learn a little more first. Know the nature of the thing before she handed him any ammunition. She told herself it was practical. "Clara," she said. "Just that, Ethan," he said. "Just that." She wondered if he was making the same calculation she was. The fever came back that afternoon, exactly as she'd said it would, high and fast. His body throwing everything it had at the infection. Clara stayed through it the way she'd stayed through the storm. Cool cloths. Water when he could swallow. Her voice. Low and steady, because her mother had always said a voice was a kind of anchor when a person was being pulled somewhere they didn't want to go. She talked about the valley, about the apple orchard her mother had planted along the south fence when Clara was very small. The way it smelled in late September, the particular gold of it. About the creek along the north pasture that ran strong in April and thin by August and had to be managed carefully or the east section went dry. About the 5 horses in her care, their personalities and problems, and the ones she'd gentled herself from green-broke and difficult. She didn't tell him her last name. He didn't ask. But somewhere in the 3rd hour of the fever, when he was between conscious and not, he said something that made her go very still. "Papa never said what happened to her," he muttered. Eyes closed, voice loose and unguarded the way fever voices were. Just that a woman tried to stop it. Said he never forgave himself for that. Clara set down the cloth she was holding. "A woman," she said quietly, not asking him. He wasn't truly there to answer. Asking the cabin walls, the fire, the 20 years of silence that had sat between their families like a wall neither side had ever tried to climb. Her mother had tried to stop it, whatever it was. She sat with that through the rest of the fever, while the afternoon light moved across the floor and the sound of the creek carried through the thin walls, and Dove made occasional soft noises from the lean-to. She sat with it, and she didn't let herself reach any conclusions. Because conclusions made from grief and fever talk were conclusions made from nothing solid. And Clara Bennett did not build anything on ground she hadn't tested first. By the second evening, the fever broke. He lay quiet and genuinely weak, the deep, hollow weakness of a body that had used everything, but his eyes were clear when they opened. And they tracked, and the gray brightness that had gone flat with the fever was back. "You've been here 2 days," he said. "I have. Your people will be looking for you. My father's in Laramie. Won't be back for 4 or 5 days. You're here alone?" "I run the place alone most of the time," Clara said. He took that in. "It's work," she said. "Hard's different, is it? Hard means it's more than one person can do. This is just work that needs doing, and I'm the one here to do it." He was quiet for a moment. "Then what kind of work?" And the question, the genuine interest in it. The absence of the particular condescension she'd learned to brace for, from men who heard about a woman running cattle, made her answer honestly. She told him about the fencing, the water rights along the creek, the sale she'd negotiated in the spring, a section of north pasture that had come back thin after a killing winter and was still causing her trouble. He listened. He asked questions that showed he understood what she was talking about, not the questions of politeness, but the questions of a man who knew land and livestock and the hard arithmetic of keeping ground that you loved from being taken from you. "You know ranching," she said. "I was raised to it," he said. "Southeast of here. Other side of the valley." Something cold moved through her chest. She kept her face still. "You said something," she said. "During the fever, about a woman, about your father." He went still. "What did I say? That he never told you what happened? That a woman tried to stop it and he never forgave himself." The silence lasted long enough that the fire settled twice. "What's your last name?" he said. His voice had changed, careful now. In a way it hadn't been. Clara looked at him across the fire. "Bennett," she said. She watched it move through him. The name landing, the recognition running fast and quiet behind his eyes. He didn't look away, he didn't harden. He looked, if anything, like a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been told the road is longer than he thought and is deciding whether to keep walking anyway. "Then you saw the saddle," he said. "In the rain. And you stayed. I told you why I stayed." "You did." He held her eyes. "My name is Ethan Hawthorne." The name sat between them like something with weight. Clara had heard it her whole life in her father's voice, in that specific register of grief that had calcified into something harder than grief. And here it was now attached to this particular man, in this firelight, who had said a woman tried to stop it, and he never forgave himself, and who had asked about her work without the condescension, and who had a horse named Dove that trusted people easier than she ought to. "Your father is James Hawthorne," Clara said. Yes, why'd you come back to the valley?" "Because I'm 29 years old," Ethan said. "And I've spent my entire life with half a story. My father won't speak of it. The hands who were there won't speak of it. All I ever got was the shape of it a night. A fire, something between our families that nobody would explain to me plain. I came back because I want the truth of it. And the men who shot you," his jaw set. "I was asking questions in Red Hollow that somebody didn't want asked. Somebody shot you for asking questions about something that happened 20 years ago. Somebody arranged for it to happen outside of town, where it looked like a road accident," he said. "Dove got me out." His voice changed on the horse's name, that same unguarded quality. The one thing about him that wasn't measured. Clara stood. She moved to the window and stood looking through the shutter crack at the valley under its wash of post-storm stars. She was thinking about her father's face the morning he'd left for Laramie, the fear in it that he hadn't quite managed to hide. She was thinking about what it meant that someone in Red Hollow had put a bullet in this man for asking questions about one night 20 years ago. She was thinking about fever talk and a woman who'd tried to stop something and a man who'd never forgiven himself. She turned around. "When you're strong enough to ride," she said, "I want to take you to the county archive in Red Hollow." Ethan watched her without moving. "My mother kept a journal," Clara said. She mentioned letters she'd written or received. something she'd kept in the county records. I found the journal after she died, and I never told my father I read it. I reckon those letters might show us something neither one of our families has been willing to look at. Why are you telling me this? Clara looked at him straight. Because you came back for the truth, and somebody shot you for looking. And because whatever happened between our families, it happened to both of us. And I'm done carrying half a story and calling it the whole one. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Your father's going to hate this, he said. My father hates a version of your family he built out of his grief, Clara said. I'd like to know if it matches the real one before I spend the rest of my life hating it alongside him. Something shifted in Ethan Hawthorne's face, then not relief. Because neither of them was built for anything as easy as relief, but something that had been braced very hard against something else. And wasn't braced quite as hard anymore. In the firelight of that small cabin, with the Wyoming night vast and indifferent around them, Clara thought it was the closest thing to hope that either of them had allowed themselves in a long time. She added wood to the fire. They didn't speak again for a while. Both of them looking at the flames. Both of them doing the quiet, necessary work of people who have just agreed to something that cannot be taken back. Outside, doves shifted in the lean-to and blew a soft sound through the thin walls. Clara found herself thinking that some creatures knew things the rest of them were still working toward. The fire burned low, the valley held its breath, and in the morning, when the light came clean and gold across the Powder River country, and Ethan Hawthorne was eating, and his shoulder was finally showing the first pale signs of turning, Clara stood in the doorway of the Pulver cabin and looked out at the land her family had worked for 30 years. She didn't feel afraid of what she'd agreed to. What she felt was something she hadn't felt in a long time, something that moved when she breathed. Something just below the surface of her chest that felt dangerously close to the specific relief of a person who has been carrying a weight alone for years and has finally, without asking for it, felt another pair of hands come up to take the other side. She drank her coffee. Dove lifted her head from the lean-to and looked at her with those patient, easy eyes. The valley opened up in every direction. Enormous, indifferent, absolutely full of whatever came next. Ethan Hawthorne was on his feet by the fourth morning, which was 2 days earlier than Clara had told him he would be. And she couldn't decide whether that was stubbornness or genuine constitution or some combination of the two that she was starting to recognize as simply the way he was built. She came back from checking the horses to find him standing outside the cabin door in the early light. Weight on both feet, left arm held close to his body the way a man holds an arm when the shoulder behind it is still a serious problem, but he's decided to act like it isn't. He'd found the basin of water she'd left inside, and he'd washed his face and done what he could with his hair, and he was looking out at the valley with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the wariness of the sick man, not the careful measuring look of the fever conversations. Something quieter than that, something that looked almost like grief. You shouldn't be standing, Clara said. Probably not, he said. He didn't move. She came to stand beside him, not close, and looked out at the same piece of valley he was looking at. The morning was clear after the storms, the kind of clear that Wyoming produced after rain, like it was apologizing for something. The light coming in long and golden across the grass and the creek line and the dark ridge of the mountains to the west. You can see the Bennett South fence from here, she said. That line of posts along the creek bend. I know, Ethan said. She looked at him. I grew up knowing where your land started, he said. My father made sure of that, same as yours made sure you knew the Hawthorne brand. What did he tell you about us? Ethan was quiet for a moment. That Thomas Bennett was a good man who had become something else. That grief did that to some men, turned them sideways. Turned them toward anger because anger was easier to live inside than loss. He paused. He said it wasn't Bennett's fault. He said it was his. Clara felt something move through her that she didn't have a clean name for. Your father blamed himself. Every day I was old enough to notice, Ethan said. I just never knew what for. She let that sit between them for a moment. The way you let something sit when you're not sure yet what shape it is or how much room it's going to need. We should talk about Red Hollow, she said. We should talk about a lot of things, Ethan said. But yes, Red Hollow inside, and Clara put coffee on real coffee. The last of what she'd packed, because some conversations required it, and they sat across from each other in the cabin's 2 chairs the way people sit when they're about to say things that matter, and they both know it. The county archive is run by a man named Horace Delp, Clara said. He's been county clerk for 15 years. He's not a bad man, but he's a careful one. Which means he pays attention to who asks for what, and he remembers it. You think he'd tell someone I'd been there asking. I think in a town the size of Red Hollow. The fact that Ethan Hawthorne and Clara Bennett walked into the county archive together would be around to every ranch within 20 miles before we cleared the county line. Ethan turned his coffee cup in his hands. You're worried about your father finding out. I'm worried about my father finding out the wrong way, Clara said. There's a difference. What's the right way? With the truth already in front of him, Clara said. So he can't argue with what we found. He can only argue with what it means. Ethan looked at her steadily. You've thought about this already. I've been thinking about it since the second night, she said. Since the saddle. He set his cup down. Tell me about your mother's journal. Clara wrapped both hands around her own cup. This was the part she hadn't told anyone. Not her father. Not the 2 women she was close enough to in Red Hollow to call friends. Not the priest when she'd sat in that church after her mother died and tried to make some kind of peace with the fact of it. My mother died when I was 16, she said, fever. The doctor said. But she'd been worn down for a long time before that. I think she was carrying something that wore on her. She paused. I found her journal in the floorboards of her sewing room 3 months after she was gone. My father didn't know about it. I don't think he ever knew she kept one. What did it say? Most of it was ordinary. Daily things, the garden, the household, notes about me and my father. But there were entries, maybe a dozen of them, spread across the last 2 years of her life that were different. She wrote about going to the Hawthorne Ranch. Ethan went very still. She wrote about it like it was something she decided to do on her own. Without telling my father, Clara said. She never wrote why in plain words. She was careful about that, like she knew someone might read it someday, and she didn't want to say too much directly. But she wrote about conversations she'd had. With your father. With someone she called the younger one, who I reckon was you. Though you'd have been a child then. I would have been 8 or 9, Ethan said. His voice had gone quiet in a way it hadn't been before. She wrote that she was trying to fix something, Clara said. She didn't say what, just that it had gone on long enough and that men would let pride kill them before they'd let go of it, and she wasn't willing to let that happen. Clara looked at the fire. The last entry that mentioned your family was written 2 weeks before she died. She wrote that she'd found something in the county records. Something that she said changed the whole shape of what happened. She wrote that she was going to tell my father when the time was right. She never got the chance, Ethan said. She never got the chance, Clara said. The fire popped. Neither of them moved. My father said a woman tried to stop it, Ethan said. He was putting it together out loud, the pieces falling into place in a way that Clara could see moving through him, not comfortable. Not easy, the particular discomfort of a truth that rearranges things you thought were fixed. He said he never forgave himself. I always thought he meant he never forgave himself for whatever started the feud. But maybe he never forgave himself for what your family's name cost her, Clara said. The silence after that was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. Heavier, more inhabited. We need to get to that archive, Ethan said. But you can't ride yet. 2 more days, he said. I can make 2 more days. 3, Clara said. And you're not going to argue with me about it. He looked at her. No, he said. I reckon I'm not. Those 3 days had their own shape to them. Different from the fever days and the storm days, slower. more deliberate, the two of them moving around each other in the small space of the cabin, with the careful tsitsikidan of people who are still deciding how much to trust and finding, against their better judgment, that the answer keeps being more than they planned. Ethan helped where he could, one-handed and slower than he'd have liked. But he wasn't a man who sat idle when there was something that could be done. He rehung the lean-to door that had been hanging crooked since Clara had first arrived. He sharpened her knife with a whetstone he found in his saddlebag, working it with his right hand. Slow and methodical, the left arm still held careful but not useless. Small things, things that didn't need to be pointed out. Clara noticed. She didn't say so on the second evening, sitting outside in the last of the light while the horses grazed nearby. He said, "Tell me about the fence." "What fence?" "The east line." "You said 2 posts had gone soft. That's why you were out there." Clara looked at him. "You want to talk about fence posts? I want to know what you were doing when you found me," he said. "I keep thinking about that. You were out doing a repair job alone, and you found a man bleeding in the grass, and you stopped everything and kept him alive for 4 days. I want to know what it cost you, the work that didn't get done, the things that piled up." It was such a specific question. Such a practical one. Not the question of a man performing interest, the question of a man who understood what it meant to have a list of necessary things and have that list interrupted by something you hadn't chosen. She told him. The fence posts, the water issue she'd been managing on the north section. The 3 things she'd meant to get done before her father returned that were now not going to be done. He listened the way he'd listened before, with the focused attention of a man who understands that the details of how land is kept are not small things, but rather the exact medium in which real life happens. "When you get back," he said, "I'll help you with the posts. Your shoulder. Give it another week," he said. "I'll do the digging. You do the stringing." She looked at him for a moment. "You're planning to still be here in a week." "I'm not planning to leave you with that fence undone," he said. Simple. Direct. Not a declaration, just a fact he'd apparently already settled in his own mind. Clara looked away first. On the 3rd morning, she declared him fit to ride, and they set out for Red Hollow before the sun was fully up. Because Clara knew the rhythms of that town, and the best time to move through it without collecting an audience was early, when the people who paid attention to things were still on their 2nd cup of coffee. She was wrong. They were still a 1/4 mile from the edge of town when she saw Walter Grayson's sorrel horse tied outside the feed store, and her stomach tightened. Walter Grayson had been her father's closest friend since before Clara was born. He was a large man, slow-moving but sharp-eyed, the kind of man who processed everything he saw and said very little about it until the moment he decided to say everything. He'd been the one to ride out and tell Thomas Bennett when the fire happened 20 years ago. He'd been there for the aftermath. He was in some ways that Clara had never fully examined. The keeper of the story, the man whose version of events had shaped everything that followed. She glanced at Ethan. He'd seen the horse too. She could tell by the slight change in how he was sitting in the saddle, not rigid, but readied, the way a person is ready when they've learned that stillness is safer than flinching. "We could go around," she said. "We could," Ethan said. "But we'd have to do it eventually. Not today. Today we go to the archive." "All right," he said. "Then let's go to the archive." They made it half a block. Clara Bennett. Walter Grayson's voice was the kind of voice that had never needed to be raised to carry. He was standing on the feed store steps, a bag of something over one shoulder, and he was looking at them with an expression that Clara recognized, the expression of a man who has already done the arithmetic and doesn't like the answer but is going to make himself perfectly clear anyway. His eyes moved from Clara to Ethan, slow and deliberate, taking in the face, the build, the way Ethan sat a horse. And whatever he found there confirmed something he'd already suspected, because his jaw set in a way that Clara had seen exactly once before. The morning after the fire, the morning he'd ridden out to the Bennett ranch to tell Thomas Bennett what he'd lost. "That's a Hawthorne horse," Walter said. "Yes, sir. Clara said. That a Hawthorne man? Clara felt Ethan shift slightly beside her, but she kept her eyes on Walter. His name is Ethan Hawthorne, she said. I found him injured on the east fence line. I tended his wound. We're here on business. Walter came down the steps. He was not a man who moved fast, but he moved with the particular deliberateness of a man who has decided something and is not going to be talked out of it easily. He stopped at Clara's stirrup and looked up at her. Your father know about this, he said. My father's in Laramie. That ain't what I asked. No, Clara said. He doesn't know yet. Walter looked at Ethan then. A long look. The kind that was meant to communicate something, a warning. A boundary, a statement of position. Ethan met it without blinking and without aggression. Which Clara noted. Son, Walter said, I don't know what you told this woman or what you think you're doing in this town. But there are people in Red Hollow who remember your family's name and not fondly. You'd do well to get what you came for and get back out. That's exactly what I intend to do, Ethan said. His voice was level, quiet. I came for the truth about what happened 20 years ago. I reckon that's something this town has been sitting on long enough. Walter's expression didn't change. But something behind it did a flicker, quick and gone. The kind of thing you only caught if you were looking for it. Clara caught it. Some things are better left where they are, Walter said. Maybe, Ethan said. But somebody in this town put bullet in my shoulder for asking questions about it. That makes me considerably less inclined to leave it alone. Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. Your father is going to hear about this. I expect he will, Clara said. I'd rather he heard it from me, so I'd appreciate you giving me the time to get back to him first. Walter said nothing. He stepped back, shifted the bag on his shoulder, and walked away without another word, which was. Clara knew, neither a yes nor a no, but something more dangerous than both. He knows something, Ethan said quietly when Walter was out of earshot. He's always known something, Clara said. I just never had a reason to push on it before. The county archive smelled like old paper and lamp oil and the particular closed-up mustiness of a place that held a great many things that people had decided to file away and not look at again. Horace Delp was behind his counter when they came in, a small, precise man with spectacles and the expression of someone whose entire professional life consisted of keeping track of things other people forgot. He looked at Clara. He looked at Ethan. He looked back at Clara. Miss Bennet, he said carefully. Morning, Horace, Clara said. I need to look at the records from 1856. Letters filed under the Bennet name. My mother may have left something in the archive. She mentioned it before she passed. Horace's eyes went to Ethan again. He's with me, Clara said. A pause. Then Horace turned and went to the back without another word, which was the most cooperation Clara had expected and more than she'd counted on. He came back with a wooden box. It was smaller than she'd imagined, the kind of box that held correspondence. Papers, the physical record of decisions that someone had thought mattered enough to preserve. Her mother's name was written on the outside, in Margaret Bennet's own hand. The handwriting Clara had grown up with, the handwriting on the birthday letters, and the household accounts, and the notes left on the kitchen table. I have gone to the Carver place. Back before supper, be good. Clara's hands were steady when she lifted the lid. She'd trained them to be. There were 7 letters inside. 6 of them were in her mother's writing, outgoing copies. Careful and precise, the kind a woman made when she knew what she was saying was important, and she wanted a record of having said it. The 7th was in a different hand, heavier, less practiced. The writing of a man who did not write often, but who had chosen his words with great care. Clara looked at the return address on the 7th letter. James Hawthorne. She heard Ethan's breath change beside her. She handed it to him without speaking. He took it the same way without speaking. She watched him read it, watched his face move through something she didn't have a name for. The way a person's face moves when they're reading something that rearranges the furniture of everything they thought they understood. "Read it to me," she said, out loud. He looked at her. Then he looked back at the letter, and he read. James Hawthorne had written to Margaret Bennett 6 weeks before the fire. The letter was not the letter of an enemy. It was the letter of a man who was frightened. Frightened of what was coming. Frightened of his own inability to stop it, writing to the one person he believed might have both the courage and the standing to intervene in something he could see building toward disaster. He wrote about a third party. Not the Bennetts, not the Hawthornes, a third man. A business arrangement gone wrong, a debt that had been called in with the kind of pressure that left men no good choices. He wrote, "I am telling you this because I believe your husband is an honest man, and I do not want what is coming to destroy him. I do not know how to stop it from my side. Perhaps you can find a way from yours." He had signed it, in good faith, James Hawthorne. The room was very quiet when Ethan finished reading. "A third party," Clara said. "Someone who isn't either of our families," Ethan said. "Someone who had something to gain from putting your family and mine against each other," Clara said. "Someone who needed us looking at each other so we wouldn't look at them." She picked up her mother's letters then, one by one, and read them in the order they'd been written. And with each one the shape of it got clearer and colder and more specific. Margaret Bennett had not been a woman who moved slowly once she understood a thing. She had written to the county land office. She had written to a lawyer in Cheyenne. She had written to 2 men in Red Hollow, whose names Clara recognized, one of them long dead, and one of them still very much alive. The last letter in the box was addressed to Walter Grayson. Clara set it on the counter and looked at it for a long moment before she picked it up. The date on the letter was 4 days before the fire. She read it twice, her mother's words. Careful and precise, laying out everything she had found in the county records. Everything James Hawthorne had told her, the name of the third party, the nature of the scheme, the specific mechanism by which a man had arranged to have 2 families destroy each other so that the land between them would be available for purchase at a loss by a party who had kept himself clean of the whole business by making sure the fire looked like the end of a feud rather than the beginning of a land grab. The name at the center of it was not a Hawthorne. It was not a Bennett. It was a name Clara knew, a name that was woven through 20 years of Red Hollow history, through county meetings and land deals, and the kind of slow, patient accumulation of property that a man could build when nobody was looking at him because they were all busy looking at each other. At the bottom of the letter, in her mother's hand, "Walter, I am trusting you with this because you are Thomas's oldest friend, and I need someone who can stand beside him when I tell him. Please come to the ranch the day after tomorrow. We will face this together." Walter Grayson had received this letter 4 days before the fire. The fire had happened 2 days after it was written. And Walter Grayson had never said a word. Clara put the letter down on the counter. She put both hands flat on the wood surface and breathed once. Slow and controlled, the way you breathed when you needed to keep yourself from doing something that couldn't be undone. "He knew," Ethan said. "He knew," Clara said. "He's known for 20 years. He's known for 20 years, Clara said. "And he stood on those feed store steps this morning and told you that some things were better left where they were." She looked at the letters in the box. Her mother's handwriting on 6 envelopes. James Hawthorne's careful, frightened script on the 7th. 20 years of silence sitting on top of all of it like a stone on a grave. "We need copies," she said, "everything in this box. I need copies of all of it before we leave this building." "Horace," Ethan said, turning to the clerk, who had been standing at the far end of his counter with the expression of a man who has heard things he cannot unhear and is still deciding how he feels about that. Horace Delp looked at them both for a moment. Then he pushed his spectacles up his nose, reached under his counter, and produced paper and ink. "I'll do it myself," he said quietly. "It'll take an hour. Come back." They went outside into the morning light of Red Hollow and stood on the boardwalk, and neither of them spoke for a moment because there wasn't a way to say the thing they were both holding that would make it easier to carry. "Your father trusted him," Ethan said finally. "My father trusts him more than he trusts anyone," Clara said. "Walter Grayson is the man my father would call if there was trouble. He's the man who talked my father back from the worst of his grief the first year after my mother died." She stopped. "He's the man who made sure my father's grief stayed pointed at your family, because if it ever pointed somewhere else, it would have pointed at him," Clara said. "And at the man your father warned my mother about." Ethan turned to look at her. "This is bigger than our families. It always was," Clara said. "We just didn't know it." Down the street, she could see Walter Grayson's sorrel horse still tied outside the feed store. Walter himself was not visible, which meant he was inside. Or he'd gone somewhere. Or, and this was the thought that sat cold in her chest, he'd gone to send word somewhere that the Bennett girl and a Hawthorne man had walked into the county archive and started asking for old letters. "We need to move faster than I planned," she said. "Your father," Ethan said. "My father comes home in 2 days," Clara said. "I need to be there when he does. I need to have those copies in my hand when he rides in. I need him to hear this from me, with the evidence already on the table, before anyone else gets to him. And if Walter gets to him first?" Clara looked at him. "Then my father is going to arrive at the ranch, believing that I've betrayed him. That I've been hiding a Hawthorne man on Bennett land and gone digging through old records trying to tear down the story he's built his grief around." She paused. "And he's going to be furious. And he's going to be wrong. And he's going to be in no condition to hear the truth when I try to tell it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Then we make sure we get there first," Clara said. He looked at her steadily. "You didn't think I was going to let you do this part alone." She thought about saying something practical about how his presence at the ranch when her father arrived would be gasoline on a fire. About how Thomas Bennett's first response to seeing Ethan Hawthorne ride in alongside his daughter was not going to be one that left room for nuance or evidence or carefully copied letters from a county archive box. She thought about all of that. "No," she said, "I reckon I didn't. Horace Delp had the copies ready in 55 minutes. He handed them over without ceremony, and then he looked at Clara with his precise, careful eyes and said, 'Your mother was a remarkable woman, Miss Bennett. I always thought it was a shame that no one ever found out how remarkable.'" Clara held his gaze. "They will now," she said. They rode out of Red Hollow, with the copies in Clara's saddlebag, and the morning already wearing toward noon, and the particular quality of urgency that comes when you're carrying something that changes everything, and the clock is already running. They hadn't made it 2 miles when they heard a rider coming up fast behind them. Clara didn't reach for her rifle. She put her hand near it. The rider pulled up alongside them, and it was not Walter Grayson, it was a boy. Maybe 15, breathing hard, from the livery near the archive. He thrust a folded note toward Clara without preamble. She opened it. It was Horace Delp's handwriting. 4 words. "Grayson left town north. North, the direction of the road to Laramie. The direction Thomas Bennett would be coming from." Clara folded the note and put it in her pocket and looked at Ethan and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. She could see in his face that he'd understood it the same way she had. They rode faster. The valley spread out around them, enormous and indifferent, and full of a truth that had been buried for 20 years under the weight of 2 families' grief. And somewhere ahead on the North Road, a man who had kept that truth buried was riding hard to make sure it stayed there. And behind him, closing the distance with every stride, were the daughter of the man he'd betrayed and the son of the man he'd helped destroy. Coming with everything her mother had tried to say before she ran out of time to say it. They rode hard for the first hour without speaking, because there wasn't anything to say that the horses' hooves weren't already saying for them on the dry ground fast. Urgent, the rhythm of people who understand that time, is the thing they have least of and can least afford to waste. Clara knew the North Road better than she knew most things. She'd ridden it with her father since she was small enough to sit in front of him in the saddle. And she knew every rise and bend, and the places where a man in a hurry would push his horse, and the places where the ground made that foolish. Walter Grayson was a good rider, but he was a heavy man. And his sorrel was strong, but not built for sustained speed. If they pushed, they had a chance. How far to the point where he'd meet your father? Ethan said. If my father left Laramie this morning, which is what he planned, the crossroads at Bitter Creek. Maybe 3 hours ahead of us. She paused. Maybe 2.5 if Walter's horse tires. Then we push. It was Ethan who saw the rider first, a shape on the rise ahead of them. Moving at a trot now instead of a gallop, the sorrel blowing hard and favoring his pace the way horses did when they'd been run past their comfortable limit. Clara saw it a half-second later and felt something cold and tight release in her chest, replaced immediately by something colder and tighter. That's him. He hasn't seen us yet. No. They pulled up behind a stand of scrub where the road bent north. And Clara thought fast and hard about the next 30 seconds, because those 30 seconds were going to determine the shape of everything that came after. If they rode up on Walter from behind, he'd know they'd been chasing him, and he'd harden into it. Walter Grayson had not kept a secret for 20 years by being a man who folded easily under pressure. If they let him go and rode ahead another way to reach her father first. There's a cutoff, she said. A quarter-mile east. Old deer trail that comes out above Bitter Creek. It's faster than the road, and Walter doesn't know I use it because my father never did. Ethan didn't ask questions. Go, he said. They went. The cutoff was rough and narrow and not built for anything larger than a deer moving carefully. But Clara's mare knew it, and Dove proved again why Ethan trusted her. The horse picked her footing without being told. Moving through the scrub and the broken ground with the focused attention of an animal that understood what was being asked and was willing to give it. Ethan rode left-handed, his right hand easy on the reins. His shoulder held careful but not babied, and Clara noticed without meaning to that he rode the way men rode who had grown up on horses rather than learned them late, not thinking about it. Just doing it, the horse and the man, one continuous thing moving through difficult ground. They came out above Bitter Creek with 20 minutes to spare. Clara knew it was 20 minutes because she knew where her father would stop to water his horse. There was a pool just south of the crossroads that Thomas Bennett had been using for 30 years. And he'd no more skip it than he'd skip breathing. She and Ethan came down off the cutoff trail onto the flat ground by the creek, and she slid off her mare and took a breath and another one, and then she heard it, the sound of a single horse coming down the road from the north at the steady, unhurried pace of a man who had done what he needed to do in Laramie and was coming home. Her father. Thomas Bennett was 61 years old, and he rode like he was 50, and thought like he was 40, and carried the weight of 20 years of specific grief, like a man who had decided the weight was load-bearing, like if he ever put it down, something essential in him would lose its shape. He was a tall man, lean, with Clara's same dark eyes and the kind of face that had been handsome once, and was now something better than handsome, weathered into honesty. Every line in it earned. He saw Clara from 50 yards out, and she watched his whole body shift with relief. The particular relief of a father who has been away from home and worried about it, and is now seeing with his own eyes that things are all right. Then he saw Ethan. He pulled up. The relief didn't just leave his face. It inverted. It became its opposite so fast that Clara's heart clenched watching it happen. The open, homecoming expression slamming shut, and something else rising in its place. Something that was old and practiced and had been kept sharp by years of use. Clara. His voice was flat. Get away from him. Papa, get away from him right now. I need you to listen to me, Clara said. She stayed where she was. She did not move toward her father, and she did not move away from Ethan. She stood between them in the dry grass by Bitter Creek, with her saddlebag over her arm and the copies of a slid inside it, and she held her ground the way her father had taught her to hold ground, which she suspected was not what he had intended when he taught her. I need 5 minutes, and I need you to hear me before you decide anything. I don't need 5 minutes to know what I'm looking at, Thomas said. He hadn't moved either. His horse was still. He was the kind of man his horse took cues from. That's a Hawthorne man. His name is Ethan Hawthorne, Clara said. He's James Hawthorne's son. I found him shot and bleeding beside the east fence 4 days ago, and I kept him alive, and before you say what you're about to say, I found things. Papa, I found things that change what you know about the night Mama died. The word Mama landed the way she'd known it would, not like a weapon. She hadn't meant it that way, but like a stone dropped into still water. The ripple of it moving out through Thomas Bennett's face in ways he couldn't control. His jaw worked once. What things? He said. Not a question. Letters, Clara said, in the county archive. Mama's letters, and one from James Hawthorne. She opened the saddlebag and held out the copies. She knew something, Papa. She'd found out what was really behind the fire, and she was trying to tell you. She wrote to Walter Grayson 4 days before it happened and asked him to come to the ranch so they could face it together. Thomas looked at the papers in her hand. He didn't reach for them. Walter never came, he said slowly. No, Clara said, he didn't. Another silence. The creek moved beside them. Thomas Bennett sat on his horse and looked at his daughter, and looked at the papers, and looked, finally, at Ethan Hawthorne and whatever he saw in Ethan's face in that moment. Whatever he found there, when he looked without the full heat of his initial reaction behind his eyes, made something shift in him that was small but visible. Get down, Thomas said. To Ethan, you want to stand on my daughter's ground. Stand on it on your feet. Ethan dismounted without a word. He stood on both feet with his left arm held careful, and he met Thomas Bennett's eyes across the space between them, and he didn't apologize, and he didn't explain, and he didn't look away. Thomas got down too. He took the papers from Clara's hand. He read slowly the way men of his generation read, moving his lips slightly over the words that mattered. Stopping and going back and stopping again, Clara watched him. She watched the moment he reached her mother's handwriting on the first letter and the way his hand tightened on the paper without his seeming to notice. She watched him read James Hawthorne's letter, and the stillness that came over him while he read it was different from his regular stillness. It was the stillness of a man standing at the edge of something he suddenly realized is much deeper than the ground he's been standing on for 20 years. He read the letter to Walter Grayson last. He read it twice. When he looked up, Clara was watching him, and Ethan was watching him, and the creek was moving, and the Wyoming sky was doing what it always did. Enormous and indifferent, and Thomas Bennett said nothing for a moment that lasted long enough to have real weight. Walter knew, he said, before the fire, Clara said. 4 days before. He never said. Thomas stopped. His voice had a quality in it that Clara had never heard before. And she had heard her father angry and grieving and frightened and bitter and every register between. This was different. This was a man discovering that the map he'd been using for 20 years had been drawn by someone who needed him to get lost. He told me it was the Hawthornes. He was the one who told me it was their doing. Yes. Sir, Ethan said quietly. Thomas looked at him. Your father wrote to my wife, yes. Sir, he was trying to warn her. He was trying to stop what was coming, Ethan said. He's told me his whole life that he wasn't able to. I never knew what he meant. I thought he meant he couldn't stop the feud. I understand now he meant he couldn't stop what someone else had set in motion. Thomas looked at the letter again. The name at the center of it, the name of the third party that Margaret Bennett had uncovered in the county records. The name that appeared in James Hawthorne's letter, and in 3 of Margaret's. The name that belonged to a man who had spent 20 years accumulating land in the Powder River Valley, while 2 families were busy burning down each other's lives. Calhoun, Thomas said. The name came out of him like something he was spitting. Dale Calhoun, you know him, Clara said. I've sold cattle to that man, Thomas said. I've sat at his table. He sent flowers when your mother died. He stopped. Something moved through him that was not expressible in any clean way too many things at once. grief and rage, and the particular nausea of discovering that someone you've broken bread with has been profiting from your suffering. He sent flowers, but Clara stepped toward him. We need to get ahead of Walter. He rode north this morning. I think he was trying to reach you before we did. I don't know how far behind us he is. Thomas looked up. The grief was still there, but something else was moving through him now too, something harder. Something that had been lying under the grief for 20 years, waiting for a purpose. And it had just found one. He'll come to the ranch, Thomas said. That's where he'll go now. He knows the road. Then we need to be there first, Clara said. We need to be there with those letters, and we need to have every word of this straight in our minds before he walks through that gate. Thomas Bennett looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he looked at Ethan Hawthorne, really looked. The way a man looks when he's making himself see something, rather than what he's always assumed was there. Is he alive? Yes, sir. He blamed himself, Thomas said. It wasn't a question exactly. Every day I can remember, Ethan said. Thomas was quiet. Then he said, so did it. I blamed myself for not protecting her. I blamed myself for every fight I'd ever had with your family, because I thought if I'd been less prideful, less ready to take offense, maybe she wouldn't have felt she needed to fix it herself. Maybe she'd have stayed home that night. His voice was steady, but it cost him to keep it that way. I blamed myself, and I blamed your family, and I let Walter Grace tell me which one mattered more, and I never questioned it, because questioning it would have meant looking at all of it again. And I couldn't stop. I couldn't do that, he said. Not for a long time. And then I just stopped looking at it at all. And called that healing. Clara put her hand on her father's arm. He covered it with his own hand, briefly, the way he did when words weren't the right tool. Then he straightened and put his hat back on and looked at the road. We ride, he said. They back to the Bennett Ranch ahead of Walter Grayson by less than an hour. Clara knew it was less than an hour because she'd barely had time to put the copies of the letters on the kitchen table and put coffee on and tell her father everything she hadn't had time to tell him at Bitter Creek before they heard a horse come through the gate at a pace that was trying to sound casual and wasn't. Thomas stood up from the table. Clara stayed seated. Ethan, who had not been invited to sit but had not been told to leave either, stood by the window with his arms at his sides and his face arranged into the kind of careful neutrality that was more expressive than any particular expression would have been. Walter Grayson knocked twice and opened the door the way he'd been opening Thomas Bennett's door for 30 years, with the assumed welcome of a man who had never been turned away. He stopped when he saw Ethan. He recovered fast. Men who kept secrets for 20 years recovered fast. Thomas, he said, I need to talk to you alone. Sit down. Walter, Thomas said. Something in Thomas's voice, the particular flatness of it, stripped of the warmth that had always been there when he spoke to Walter Grayson, made Walter go very still. Thomas said, sit down. Walter sat. Thomas picked up the letter from the table. Margaret's letter, the one addressed to Walter, the one dated 4 days before the fire. He set it in front of Walter without a word. Walter looked at it. His face did not change in the way Clara had expected. He didn't blanch. Didn't reach for it, didn't perform surprise. He looked at the letter and then he looked at Thomas, and the thing Clarissa saw in his face was worse than guilt. It was resignation. The resignation of a man who has known for 20 years that this moment was coming and has simply been living in the interval before it arrived. She gave it to you herself, Thomas said. She trusted you with it. She asked you to come. Thomas, it's more complicated than. She asked you to come, Thomas said again. And his voice was quiet in the way that a man's voice went quiet when it was the only thing he had left to hold on to. And you didn't come. And 2 days later she was dead and my barn was ash, and you stood in my yard and told me it was the Hawthorns. I was trying to protect you, Walter said. The room went absolutely silent. Even the fire seemed to go quieter. Protect me, Thomas said. Calhoun had men, Walter said. And now it was coming out, the 20-year-old thing. The thing that had been sitting inside him all this time. And Clara understood that there was a kind of relief in it even now. The relief of a weight that had been carried too long, finally being set down regardless of the consequences. He had men who would have Thomas, the letter Margaret found. The records she'd pulled from the county office, Calhoun knew she had them. He knew she'd been to see James Hawthorne. He came to me. He told me if I kept quiet and let the thing run its course, my family would be safe. If I went to you, my wife would not have been safe, Thomas said. The silence after that was the worst kind. Not empty, full. Full of 20 years of grief, finding its actual shape for the first time. She was already gone, Thomas, Walter said, and his voice broke on it. Cracked down the middle like old wood. By the time he came to me, the fire had already. He stopped. I told myself there was nothing left to do. I told myself coming forward would only put more people in danger, and nothing would bring her back. I told myself that every day for 20 years. You told yourself, Thomas said. Yes, and you told me it was the Hawthorns. I needed the story to go somewhere, Walter said. I needed you to have somewhere to put it. I thought. He stopped again. I thought if you knew the truth, you'd go after Calhoun and he'd kill you. And I couldn't. His voice failed completely. You were the only real friend I ever had. Thomas, I was trying to keep you alive. By feeding me a lie that ate 20 years of my life, Thomas said. Walter said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Ethan moved then, not toward Walter, not aggressively. But he crossed the room and picked up the copies of his father's letter and set them on the table in front of Walter. And he said, my father spent those same 20 years blaming himself for not doing more. For writing to Margaret Bennett and then not being able to stop what happened. He's an old man now and he's never once slept easy. He paused. Whatever you were afraid of, you weren't the only one paying for it. Walter looked at the letter in James Hawthorne's hand. Something moved through his face that was beyond guilt. Beyond shame, the particular devastation of a man who has lived long enough with a thing to have stopped seeing its full weight and is now being made to see it all at once. Dale Calhoun, Thomas said. What I want to know is where he is right now. Still in Red Hollow, Walter said. He never left. He's been here the whole time, buying up land piece by piece. He's got the Mercer parcel now, the old Duval property. 3 sections of grazing land along the creek that he picked up from families who couldn't hold on after hard winters. Families who had a harder time holding on because 2 of the valley's biggest ranches were spending their energy hating each other instead of being neighbors, Clara said. Walter closed his eyes. Where's the original? Thomas said. The original records my wife found. Not copies, the actual documents she pulled from the county office. Walter opened his eyes. There's a lockbox, he said slowly, at the First Territorial Bank. Margaret gave me a key for safekeeping. He reached inside his coat and produced it small. Iron worn smooth from years of handling. I've carried it for 20 years, he said. I told myself I was keeping it safe. I think I was keeping it close because it was the last thing she ever trusted me with. He set it on the table. Thomas looked at the key. Then he picked it up and held it in his fist and was quiet for a moment that was between him and his wife and whatever understanding he was reaching about the 20 years just past and the ones ahead of him. You're going to come with us to that bank, Thomas said. You're going to stand beside me when I open that box. And then you're going to stand beside me in front of every man in Red Hollow who needs to hear what you know about Dale Calhoun and what he did to this valley, Thomas. That's not a request. Walter, Thomas said. That's the price of 20 years. Walter Grayson sat at that table for a long moment. He was an old man in a way that he hadn't looked when he'd walked through the door. Something had gone out of him in the last hour. And what was left was smaller and more honest and more human than what Clara had seen standing on those feed store steps that morning. All right, Walter said. All right. The ride to Red Hollow that afternoon was not a quiet one. Though none of them said much. The quiet was the loud kind, the kind that happens when several people are each doing the internal work of rearranging things that have been in place a long time and finding that the process requires most of their attention. Tom S. Bennett rode without looking at Ethan Hawthorne for the first part of the ride. Then he did look once, and whatever he found worth saying came out in 3 words. "Your father know?" "Not yet," Ethan said. Thomas nodded and looked at the road ahead and said, "He should hear it from you." "Yes, sir," Ethan said. "I know it." Calvin Marsh, who ran the First Territorial Bank in Red Hollow, had the expression of a man who had opened his vault for unexpected reasons before, and had learned not to ask questions that were none of his business, which was probably why he'd held the position for 15 years. He took one look at Thomas Bennett, Walter Grayson, Clara Bennett, and a man he'd never seen before walking into his bank together, and he simply unlocked the back room and stood aside. The lockbox was exactly where Walter said it would be. Thomas fit the key and opened it. The documents inside were Margaret Bennett's originals, the records she had pulled from the county land office. Annotated in her careful hand, cross-referenced, and organized with the methodical intelligence of a woman who had known exactly what she was doing and had taken the time to do it properly. Land deeds, transfer records, a promissory note bearing Dale Calhoun's name and 2 other signatures, one of which Clara saw was a county official who had since died, and one of which was a bank officer who had since moved to Denver, and both of whom had been, according to the notation in her mother's hand, complicit in filing false boundary claims that had set the conditions for the conflict between the Bennett and Hawthorne ranches. There was also a sworn statement, written in Margaret Bennett's hand and witnessed by the county clerk of the time, not Horace Delp, his predecessor, a sworn statement that laid out everything she had found, in plain language, with the specific legal citations that a woman who had clearly taught herself a great deal about property law had taken the time to track down. At the bottom of the statement, in her mother's handwriting, Clara read, "I make this record so that if something should happen to me, the truth will survive me. I trust that whoever finds this will do what I was not able to finish." Clara put the statement down on the table. Her hands were steady. Her father reached over and covered them with one of his without looking at her, and she let him. And the 2 of them stayed like that for a moment while Walter Grayson sat across the table and looked at the document, and Ethan stood at a door with his arms at his sides, and the late afternoon light came through the bank's one window and lay across the table where Margaret Bennett's words had just outlasted 20 years of silence. "We need a lawyer," Ethan said. "There's one in Red Hollow," Clara said. "Frank Abelin, you sure?" Thomas said. "Mama thought so," Clara said. "She mentioned him in her journal. Said he was the only lawyer in 100 miles she'd trust with something that mattered." Thomas looked at her. Then he looked back at the documents, and he made the sound that men made when they were deciding something large and final, and were making it without argument. "Go get him," he said. Clara went. Frank Abelin was 60 years old and had the build of a man who had spent his life sitting at a desk and the mind of a man who had spent his life not being fooled. He came to the bank without being told twice, read every document in the box without speaking, asked 4 questions that were each more pointed than the one before, and then sat back and looked at Thomas Bennett and said, "This is enough. This has been enough for 20 years. The question is whether this town has the stomach to act on it. This town is going to have to find the stomach," Thomas said. "Because I've spent 20 years without the truth and I'm done with it." Frank Abelin nodded once. He looked at Ethan. "You're a Hawthorne?" "Yes, sir. Your father's James Hawthorne?" "Yes, sir." "He's a good man who made a bad choice when he was frightened," Frank said. "Not the worst thing I've ever heard of." He looked back at Thomas. "Getting a fraud case of this scale prosecuted is going to take time. It's going to take testimony, to take both your families standing up in front of this county and saying what you know together in a way that makes it impossible to dismiss." "We'll stand," Thomas said. "Both families," Frank said. He looked at Ethan again. "My father will stand," Ethan said. He said it with a certainty that Clara heard, and she thought not for the first time, and not for the last, that this was a man who understood his father better than his father knew. Then we start tomorrow morning, Frank said. Tonight. Nobody talks to Dale Calhoun. Nobody tips him that we're coming. If he gets wind of this and has time to move his assets or call in favors with the right county officials, he won't get wind of it, Walter Grayson said. Everyone looked at him. I've kept his secret for 20 years, Walter said. He looked older than when he'd walked into the bank, and he wasn't done looking older. I reckon I know how to keep ours for one night. The walk back out into Red Hollow's late afternoon was disorienting in the way that all true revelations were disorienting. One's look, the payment, was completely different. The same boardwalks and storefronts and the same faces of people going about the ordinary business of their ordinary days. None of them knowing that in the back room of the First Territorial Bank, 20 years of calculated injustice had just been laid out in Margaret Bennett's careful handwriting and found to be exactly what it was. Clara walked beside her father. Ethan walked on her other side. Thomas Bennett was quiet for half the length of the main street. Then he said, without looking at Ethan, your horse. The bay, she take to strangers? Ethan looked at him. Easier than she should, he said. Thomas made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the same family. Mine's the same way, he said. Never been able to train it out of her. It was the smallest thing. A sentence about a horse's temperament. But Clara felt it like the first breath after a long time underwater, the moment when the pressure changes and you understand that you are going to surface, that the air is there, that the distance between where you are and where you can breathe is finally, after a very long time, beginning to close. She didn't say anything. She walked between her father and Ethan Hawthorne in the late afternoon light of Red Hollow, and she thought about her mother's words on the last page of that sworn statement. The ones that had been sitting in a lockbox in a bank for 20 years waiting for someone to open it. I trust that whoever finds this will do what I was not able to finish. I'm going to finish it, Mama, Clara said inside. To herself. To the woman who had been brave enough to start a thing that cost her everything and trusted the world to complete it. The sun moved west over the Powder River Valley, and in the morning, the reckoning would begin. The night before the reckoning, nobody slept well. Clara knew this because she didn't sleep at all. And she could hear her father moving in the room beside hers, the creak of floorboards, the sound of a chair being pulled back from the table, the particular silence of a man sitting alone with something too large to put down long enough to rest. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and let the night do what nights did, which was give everything its full weight without the mercy of distraction. She thought about her mother's handwriting on those documents. The precision of it, the care. Margaret Bennett had known she was building something that might have to stand without her. So she had built it to last, every citation exact. Every cross-reference followed through. The sworn statement witnessed and filed and locked away by the one person she had trusted, who had then failed the trust so completely that it had taken 20 years and her daughter to finish what she'd started. Clara didn't let herself feel the anger of that all at once. She took it in pieces, the way you ate when you'd gone too long without food and knew that too much too fast would make you sick. Piece by piece. Manageable. Around 2 a.m, she got up and went to the kitchen, and her father was already there. Thomas Bennett was sitting at the table with Margaret's journal open in front of him. The one Clara had found in the floorboards of the sewing room. She'd brought it out before supper without discussion. Just set it on the table beside the copied letters. And her father had looked at it for a long moment and not touched it. And she'd understood he wasn't ready. He was ready now. Apparently, at 2 a.m, with the ranch dark around him and the Wyoming night pressing against the windows. He looked up when she came in. You knew about this, he said. The journal. Not an accusation, a recognition. I found it when I was 16, Clara said. 3 months after she passed. You kept it all this time. I kept it because I didn't know what to do with it, and I was afraid of what it would do to you, Clara said. She sat down across from him. I was 16. You were barely holding together. I couldn't put something else on top of what you were already carrying. Thomas looked at the journal. He turned a page with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something breakable. She writes about you, he said. In here, she writes about you the way he stopped and steadied himself. She was so proud of you. She said you had her stubbornness and my steadiness, and that the combination was going to make you either extraordinary or impossible, and she reckoned probably both. Clara's throat tightened. That sounds like her. It does, Thomas said. He closed the journal and put both hands flat on the cover. She was trying to protect us, he said. That's all she was ever doing. And I spent 20 years being angry at the wrong people, while Calhoun, he stopped. While Calhoun sat in this valley and ate at my table, and I sold him cattle and thanked him for the business. You didn't know, Clara said. I should have looked harder, Thomas said. You were grieving. I was grieving in the wrong direction, Thomas said. And Walter kept me pointed that way, because it was easier for him than the truth. And I let him because it was easier for me too. He was quiet for a moment. That's the part I have to sit with. Not just what was done to us, what I let happen, because the truth was harder than the story. Clara reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his palm up and held it the way he had when she was small, and the world had been a simpler, safer place, or at least had seemed so. What time is Abilene expecting us, he said. 8 o'clock, Clara said. Ethan is riding to his father's place at first light. He wants James Hawthorne there when it happens. Thomas was quiet at the name. Not hostile, just quiet. What kind of man is he said. The son. Clara thought about how to answer that honestly. He's the kind of man who came back to a valley that shot him for asking questions, she said. He's the kind of man who, when I told him to stay still because his shoulder wasn't healed, said yes ma'am and meant it. He's the kind of man whose horse trusts strangers. She paused. He's not what you were told he was, Papa. He's not what either of us expected. Thomas said nothing for a long moment. Then, his father wrote to your mother, because he was frightened, and he didn't know who else to trust. That takes something. To reach across that much bad history and ask for help. It does, Clara said. And Margaret went to them, Thomas said. She went to the Hawthorne ranch. More than once, according to what you found. He shook his head slowly. Not in anger, but in the particular sorrow of a man discovering that the person he loved had been larger and braver than even he had known. She never told me. I reckon she knew I wasn't ready to hear it. She was waiting for the right time, Clara said. She ran out of time, Thomas said. That sat between them the way only true things sat without needing to be agreed with or argued against. Just acknowledged. We're going to finish it, Clara said. Tomorrow. We're going to finish what she started. Thomas Bennett looked at his daughter across the kitchen table in the 2 a.m. dark, and he said, You're so much like her. Clara didn't trust herself to speak. So she just held his hand and they sat there together until the sky outside began to go from black to the particular dark blue that preceded dawn. And the ranch came slowly back to life around them. And the day they'd been moving toward since Clara found a bleeding man in the grass beside her fence began in earnest. Ethan left before sunrise. He'd slept in the barn Thomas had offered the spare room with the stiff courtesy of a man doing the right thing before he was fully ready to do it. And Ethan had declined with the equally careful courtesy of a man who understood the difference between what he was offered and what he should take. Clara had brought him a blanket and coffee, and he'd thanked her with the particular economy of words that she was coming to understand was simply how he was not cold. Not withholding, just precise. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said, and he didn't use more words than the thing required. Your father, she said, standing in the barn door with the dark still full around them. What's he going to say when you tell him? I don't know, Ethan said. He was saddling Dove with one hand, teeth, managing it with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned to work around the shoulder rather than through it. It's going to break something open in him that's been closed a long time. I don't know what comes out when that happens. Will he come? Ethan looked at her. He'll come, he said. Whatever else he is, my father has been waiting 20 years for a chance to stand up and say what he knows. I think the only thing that kept him from coming back sooner was not knowing whether there was anything left to stand up for. There is, Clara said. I know it, Ethan said. And when I tell him what we found when I put your mother's letter in his hands, and he sees that James Hawthorne wrote the truth, and someone kept it safe all this time, he stopped. Steadied. He's going to want to say something to your father. I don't know if your father's ready for that. He'll have to be, Clara said. We're past ready. Ethan finished with the saddle and turned to face her. In the dark of the barn, with the first gray of pre-dawn just beginning to show at the door behind her, he looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and he said, Whatever happens today, whatever your father decides about me, about my family, about any of it, I want you to know that what you did mattered. Not just pulling me out of the grass, all of it. The letters. The archive, the ride to Bitter Creek. Your mother started something and you finished it. And that's he stopped. That matters, Clara. It was the first time he'd used her name without it being in the context of something practical. And she felt it differently than she'd felt it before. Which she noted and set aside, because today was not the day for that particular reckoning. Go get your father, she said. We'll see you in Red Hollow at 8. He went. The ride to Red Hollow that morning had a different quality than any of the rides that had preceded it. Thomas Bennett rode straight and set-jawed the way he rode when he'd made up his mind about something and was moving toward it rather than away from it. Clara rode beside him and felt the change in him, subtle but real. The way the quality of air changed before rain, the pressure of something about to break. Frank Abilene had the documents laid out on the table in his office when they arrived. He'd worked through part of the night himself. Apparently there were notes in his cramped handwriting, stacked beside Margaret's originals, and the copies from the archive. And he'd flagged specific passages with strips of paper and written cross-references in the margins that showed he'd been thinking hard about the architecture of what they were going to present and to whom. Territorial court, Frank said without preamble. This is too large for the county magistrate and too entangled with local interests. We go over their heads. How long does that take? Thomas said. Filing takes 2 days. Hearing gets scheduled within 30 days given the fraud scale. But Frank paused. Calhoun is going to know something is coming the moment we file. He has enough friends in enough offices that word will reach him fast. Once he knows, he's going to move to protect his assets. Which means, we need to move on his assets before he can, Clara said. Frank looked at her. We need a court order freezing his property holdings pending investigation. I can file for that simultaneously with the fraud claim. But a judge has to sign it, and the only judge with jurisdiction who I trust to sign it without tipping Calhoun first is Judge Hen Price in Casper. How far is Casper? Thomas said. 2 days hard ride, Clara said. 1 day if you change horses at the midpoint station, Frank said. Thomas looked at his daughter. You've been 2 days without proper sleep already. I've been 2 days without proper sleep before, Clara said. Who goes to Casper? Someone Calhoun won't expect to move that fast, Frank said. He looked at Clara with the expression of a man who had just answered his own question. Someone he doesn't see coming. The door opened. Ethan Hawthorne came in first. Behind him came James Hawthorne. Clara had built a picture of James Hawthorne from 20 years of her father's descriptions and 2 weeks of thinking about the man who had written that letter to her mother, and the man who walked through Frank Abilene's door fitted neither image precisely. He was older than she'd expected, older than her father. By the look of it, with the particular oldness that came from carrying guilt for a long time. He moved carefully, the way men moved when they'd worked hard their whole lives, and the work had left its record in their joints and their gait. He had Ethan's eyes, the same storm gray, but where Ethan's held watchfulness, James Hawthorne's held something that had been braced against something else. For so long it had forgotten how not to be braced. He looked at Thomas Bennett and stopped walking. Thomas looked at James Hawthorne and went very still. The room held its breath. 20 years of distance between two men stood in Frank Abeline's office on a Wednesday morning in 1876, and it did not look the way hatred was supposed to look. It looked like two old wounds standing in the same room recognizing each other. "Thomas," James Hawthorne said. His voice was not what Clara expected either. Not defensive, not combative. Just present. The voice of a man who had decided something on the ride-in and was not going to take it back. "James," Thomas said. That was all for a moment. Two names. The entire history between them compressed into that exchange. All the weight of it. And Clara could feel it in the room, the way you felt a change in weather physical. Pressing, impossible to ignore. "I wrote to your wife," James said. "I should have done more. I knew what Calhoun was building toward, and I wrote a letter instead of writing over myself and telling you to your face, and I have lived with that every day since." "She trusted you enough to come to your ranch," Thomas said. "More than once. She was the bravest person I ever met who wasn't kin to me," James said. "She was trying to stop something that two stubborn men had let get too far. I didn't deserve the trust she put in me, and I couldn't keep her safe, and I'm sorry for it." Thomas: "I've been sorry for 20 years, and I didn't know how to say it to your face because I didn't think you'd let me get close enough." Thomas Bennett was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Clara started to wonder if he was going to say anything at all. Long enough that Ethan shifted slightly beside her. The barely there adjustment of a man who was prepared to intervene if something went wrong and was hoping it wouldn't. "I blamed you," Thomas said finally, "for all of it. For 20 years I told anyone who'd listen that the Hawthorns were behind what happened to my wife and my barn and my everything. And you were out there on your land carrying your own grief, and I was adding to it every time your name came up in town." He stopped. His voice was doing the thing it had done at 2 in the morning, at the kitchen table, steady on the surface. "At significant cost. That wasn't right. I didn't know the truth. But I also didn't look for it. I let Walter Grayson point me where he needed me pointed, and I didn't ask harder because the answers were, because looking for the real answers meant sitting with the loss instead of the anger. And I chose the anger." James Hawthorne looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I'd have done the same." "Maybe," Thomas said. "But I'm done doing it now." He crossed the room. He put his hand out. James Hawthorne looked at the hand. Then he took it, and the two men stood there in Frank Abeline's office and shook hands, the way men of their generation shook hands when they meant it not a gesture but a statement. The physical record of a decision made in full knowledge of what it cost. Clara looked at Ethan. He was watching his father's face, and what she saw in Ethan's expression was something she'd only glimpsed before in the quiet moments of the past several days, the unguarded version of him. The one that existed under the watchfulness and the careful measuring. He looked, in that moment, like a man who had been holding a door closed against something for a very long time and had just been told he could let go. Frank Abeline cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, we have a considerable amount of work to do before Calhoun figures out that the ground is moving under him." The work took most of the day. Frank walked them through the legal architecture piece by piece, the fraud claim, the property freeze, the witness testimony they'd need from James Hawthorne about the original pressure Calhoun had applied, the testimony from Walter Grayson about the cover-up, the records from the county archive that Margaret Bennett had assembled with the foresight of a woman who understood that the truth needed to be bulletproof if it was going to survive. Walter arrived at 10 o'clock, which was later than he'd said he'd come, and earlier than Clara had believed he would. He came without being fetched, which she took as its own kind of statement. He sat across from James Hawthorne at Frank's table, and neither man said anything for a moment. And then James said, "You should have come to the ranch that night." "Walter, I know it," Walter said. "You should have told Thomas what you knew. I know that too. Are you going to make it right now?" Walter looked at him. "That's why I'm here." He was, whatever else was, whatever the 20 years of silence made him. whatever accounting he would face for the part he'd played. Walter Grayson sat in Frank Abilene's office and gave his testimony with the thoroughness of a man who had decided that the only thing left that had any value was honesty. He named dates and conversations. He described exactly what Calhoun had said to him in the days after the fire, the specific threat that had been made against his family, the bargain he had struck and the price it had extracted from him across 2 decades of living with it. He described how he had kept Thomas Bennett's anger pointed at the Hawthorns. He described the letter. Walter had burned Margaret's first letter, written a week before the one Clara had found, the one that had been more explicit, and which Walter had destroyed because it was more explicit. His hands were steady while he talked. His voice was not. When he finished, the room was quiet in the way. Rooms went quiet after something large had been said. "That's enough for the filing," Frank said quietly. "That combined with the documents, that's more than enough." Thomas looked at Walter across the table. The look lasted a long time. "You burned her first letter," he said. "Yes," Walter said. "She wrote to you twice and you burned the one that named him clearly." "Yes." Thomas stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room for a moment. Clara watched him. She knew what he was doing, the same thing she did when something was too large to contain in a closed space. The same habit of needing the horizon for the thoughts that wouldn't fit inside 4 walls. He turned around. "Are we done here for today?" he said to Frank. "For today," Frank said. "I'll have the filing ready by morning. Casper is the next step." "Clara goes to Casper," Thomas said. "I thought so too," Frank said. Thomas looked at his daughter. "You take the filing to Judge Price. You explain it to him the way you explained it to me at Bitter Creek, plain and direct with the evidence in your hand. Harlan Price is a fair man, and he doesn't owe Calhoun anything because he's never had business with him." He paused. "You go tomorrow at first light. You take someone with you." He looked at Ethan when he said this last part. "Not a warm one, exactly, but a direct one. The kind that communicated a specific meaning to the specific person it was aimed at." Ethan said, "I'll have her in Casper by nightfall tomorrow." Thomas nodded once. The matter was settled in the way that practical men settled matters briefly, with forward motion. Outside, Red Hollow was going about its ordinary business in complete ignorance of what had been decided inside Frank Abilene's office. Clara stood on the boardwalk in the afternoon light and watched the town and thought about the way things looked normal, right up until the moment they stopped being normal, and how you could never tell from the outside which ordinary-looking day was the last one. She felt Ethan come to stand beside her. "Your father," he said. "He's going to be all right." "I know it," Clarissa said. He needs some time to put things back in the right order in his mind. He's a methodical man. He'll get there." "James is the same way," Ethan said. "He's been in there talking to your father for 10 minutes, and I half expect them to come out with a joint plan for the spring grazing season." Clara looked at him. "Is that your version of a joke?" "It might be," Ethan said. She almost smiled. "Almost. Calhoun," she said. "What do you think he does when he finds out?" "He runs," Ethan said. Without hesitation. Men like that always run when the ground goes out from under them. The whole scheme depended on nobody ever putting the pieces together. Once they're put together and he knows it, staying in the valley has no upside for him. "The property freeze stops him from taking his gains with him," Clara said. "That's the point of Casper. Then we'd better get there before he decides to cut his losses and go," Ethan said. Before Clara could respond, the door behind them opened and James Hawthorne came out. And then Thomas Bennett and the 2 men stood on the boardwalk in the afternoon light of Red Hollow, with the particular expressions of men who have just said things that needed saying and are still feeling. The shape of the conversation settling around them. James Hawthorne looked at Clara. "Miss Bennett," he said. He used the formal address the way his son didn't. Ethan had stopped using it within the first day. James used it carefully, as if he understood that familiarity was something he had no right to assume. "Your mother was a good woman. I've never found a way to say that to anyone who mattered." And I'd like to say it now if you'll allow it." Clara looked at this old man with his gray eyes and his careful voice and the guilt he'd carried until it had aged him past his years. And she thought about her mother writing letters in secret and riding to the Hawthorne Ranch and building a legal case from the county records because she had decided she was not going to let pride and stubbornness and one man's greed destroy two families who had no real quarrel with each other. She knew what she was doing, Clara said, and she knew it might not work. But she did it anyway. That's exactly right, James said. She did it anyway. The afternoon wore on. Walter Grayson left first, riding out without ceremony. Clara watched him go and felt something complicated that she didn't try to simplify. He had done something unforgivable, and he had spent 20 years paying for it in the particular way that secret keepers paid, which was without anyone knowing the price or offering absolution. What happened to him legally was Frank Abilene's territory. What happened to him in his own conscience was between him and whatever accounting he made with himself in the years he had left. She didn't feel forgiving, and she didn't feel vindictive, and she put both aside because neither was useful right now. Frank came out with the preliminary filing in hand and a list of what he still needed before morning. Clara sat with him for another hour, going through details, making sure nothing was missed, because her mother had not missed anything, and Clara was her mother's daughter, and she was not going to be the place the chain broke. At one point, Ethan brought her coffee without being asked. He set it beside her, without interrupting what she was saying to Frank, and stepped back, and she registered it, and kept talking. But she registered it the small, unpretentious practicality of it. The "this, what's needed so I'm doing it" quality that she was coming to think of as one of his most distinctive characteristics. The one that had revealed itself first when he'd rehung the lean-to door on his own. One-handed, 3 days into his recovery. When Frank finally rolled up the documents and declared them ready as they were going to be before morning, the sun was well past its midpoint and the shadows in Red Hollow were going long. James Hawthorne and Thomas Bennett had been talking for most of the afternoon. Clara didn't know what they'd said to each other. She heard fragments, something about the water rights along the creek, something about a winter 2 years back that had hit both ranches hard, something that sounded at one point like her father, describing the particular stubbornness of the breed of cattle he favored, and James Hawthorne disagreeing with him about it in the direct way that men disagreed about cattle, which was different from the way men disagreed about most things. It was not forgiveness exactly, it was not the clean, sudden thing that stories made reconciliation out to be. It was two men who had been shaped by the same geography and the same grief and the same 20 years of misdirected anger, finding that when you stripped away the story, the men underneath it had more in common than the story had allowed for. It was a beginning, that was enough. On the ride back to the Bennett Ranch, Thomas pulled his horse alongside Ethan's for the first time since Bitter Creek. Clara rode slightly ahead, giving them the space that the moment seemed to require. And she did not try to hear what was said. She caught fragments her father's voice, low and direct, and Ethan's voice answering in the same register. She caught her own name once. She caught the word shoulder once. And then something that might have been a question, and something that might have been an answer. When they reached the ranch gate, Thomas Bennett stopped his horse and looked at the land around him, the east fence line. The creek bend, the south field where the orchard her mother had planted, was going gold in the late summer heat. He looked at it for a long time. "I've been running this place with one hand for 20 years, he said. The other hand was busy holding on to something I should have let go of a long time ago." He looked at Ethan. "I ain't saying everything's settled. I ain't saying 20 years is something you'd just ride past. But I'm saying the hand's open now." He paused. "That means something to you or not?" Ethan looked at Thomas Bennett steadily. "It means something," he said. Thomas nodded. He rode through the gate. Clara stopped beside Ethan, and they sat their horses in the early evening light for a moment, without speaking. "Casper tomorrow," Ethan said. "First light," Clara said. He looked at her that long, measuring look that had so much more in it now than it had on that first morning in the cabin, when it had been the look of two strangers deciding how much the other one was safe to trust. This was different. This was the look of a man who had decided something and was doing her the courtesy of letting her see that he'd decided it, without pressing her on what she thought about it. She looked back at him the same way. "We'll make it in time," she said. "We'll get to Casper, and we'll get the freeze order, and we'll come back here with everything my mother built, and everything your father knew, and we're gonna make it count." "Yes," Ethan said. "We are." They rode in. The ranch gate closed behind them. And in the morning, before the sun cleared the ridge, they would ride out again toward Casper, toward the judge, toward the final piece of a thing that had been waiting 20 years for someone brave enough to carry it home. The valley held its breath and held its dark, and Clara Bennett lay in her own bed for the first time in a week and looked at the ceiling and felt something she hadn't felt in so long that it took her a moment to name it. Not peace, exactly, not yet, but the ground underneath her felt solid in a way it hadn't in a long time. Like something false had been removed from beneath it, and what remained was real. Was load-bearing, was the actual earth, and you could build on the actual earth in a way you could never quite build on a story. She closed her eyes. In the next room, she heard her father's chair settle. For the first time in 20 years, after a while, she heard it go quiet. They left before the sun. Clara had the saddlebag packed and Dove already tied to the post when Ethan came out of the barn. And he looked at the horse and looked at Clara and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying but the fact that she'd saddled his horse for him without being asked. His shoulder was better but not good, and the ride to Casper was going to be long. And they both knew it. Thomas came out to see them off. He stood on the porch with his coffee, and he looked at his daughter, and then he looked at Ethan Hawthorne. And the look he gave Ethan was not the look from Bitter Creek, and not the look from Frank Abilene's office. It was a different look, the kind a man gave when he was still working something out, but he'd decided to act better judgment while he worked. "You ride careful," he said, to both of them, but he was looking at Ethan when he said it. "Yes, sir," Ethan said. Thomas nodded. He looked at Clara. "You bring that order back signed." "I will," Clara said. "I know you will," Thomas said. "You always do what you say you're going to do." "You got that from your mother." He went back inside before she could answer. Which was probably intentional. Thomas Bennett had never been comfortable receiving emotion in the open air, and he'd learned to remove himself before it could land on him wrong. Clara mounted up and looked at the ranch one more time, the fence line, the orchard, the creek bend, catching the first gray pre-dawn light, and then she looked forward and they rode. The road to Casper was long and honest about being long. No shortcuts, no cut-off trails that shaved time the way the deer track above Bitter Creek had. Just the road, the miles, the particular physical work of a sustained hard ride that left no room for anything except the next hour and then the hour after that. They pushed without pushing too hard, which was its own kind of judgment. They needed the horses fresh enough to make time. Not blown out by noon, Ethan rode well even one-handed. Clara had noticed this before, and she noticed it again now. The way he managed Dove with the economy of motion, that was either natural aptitude or a great many years of practice. "Probably both. An hour out," he said. "Tell me about Casper." "Judge Price, Frank Abilene, says he's fair," Clara said. "He's territorial court, which means he answers to Denver. Not to any of the county interests that Calhoun might have influence with. He's got a reputation for not being impressed by money or land holdings or family names when he's got documents in front of him." "Good," Ethan said. "Frank says he's also got a short temper with people who waste his time," Clara said. "So we go in with everything organized and we say what we need to say plain and we don't pad it." "That suits me," Ethan said. "I know it does," Clara said, and she did know it. Which still struck her sometimes, how quickly you could learn the shape of a person when circumstances stripped away the ordinary social layers and got down to what someone actually was. They made the midpoint station by early afternoon. changed horses the way Frank had recommended, ate quickly, and pushed on. The second half of the ride was harder than the first. The way second halves always were, the body having used its optimism in the first stretch and now running on the more austere fuel of plain determination. Clara didn't complain. Ethan didn't complain. They rode. It was during that second stretch, somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, with Casper still 2 hours ahead of them and the road empty in both directions, that Ethan said, "After this is done, after the hearing, after Calhoun is dealt with, after your father and mine have had the time they need to, what do you want?" Clara looked at him. "For yourself," he said. "Not for the ranch, not for your father. Not for your mother's memory. What does Clara Bennett want when the thing she's been carrying is finally set down?" Nobody had asked her that. Not in recent memory. She'd been so long in the posture of doing what needed to be done that the question of what she actually wanted had become something she deferred. The way you deferred a repair that wasn't urgent when there were urgent things ahead of it. "The orchard," she said. "It came out without deliberation. My mother planted it, and my father's never been able to tend it properly because every time he looked at it, he saw her. It's been growing wild for 10 years. I want to restore it. I know which trees are worth saving and which ones have gone too far, and I've had the whole plan in my head since I was about 19. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "What else?" She looked at the road ahead. "I want a season where the biggest problem I'm solving is a practical one. Not a grief problem or a feud problem or a 20-year-old injustice problem. Just the water rights need managing, the cattle need moving. The fence posts need replacing. The ordinary problems of a working ranch. I want a whole season of just that." "That's not too much to want," Ethan said. "No," Clara said. "I reckon it isn't." He didn't say anything else for a while. But she noticed that he didn't ask the question and then talk about himself. The way people did when the question was really about getting an opening for their own answer. He just asked and listened and let the answer be what it was. Casper came into view just as the sun was hitting the western hills. Judge Harlan Price was not what Clara had expected and was exactly what Frank Abilene had described. He was a compact man with a gray beard trimmed to military precision and the eyes of someone who had spent a long professional life being lied to and had developed a reliable method for identifying when it was happening. He received them in his office without ceremony. Frank had sent a wire ahead, which had helped, and he looked at the documents without speaking for a long time. Clara sat across from him with her hands in her lap and let him read. Ethan sat beside her and did the same. Neither of them filled the silence, because Frank Abilene had been right that this man didn't need padding. Price looked up after 20 minutes. He looked at Clara first. "You're Thomas Bennett's daughter?" "Yes, sir. These are your mother's documents." "Yes, sir. She assembled them in the months before she died. They've been in the First Territorial Bank lockbox in Red Hollow for 20 years. And this," he held up Walter Grayson's signed testimony. "This man is prepared to repeat this in open court." "He is," Clara said. "He understands what's required of him." Price looked at Ethan. "And you're James Hawthorne's son?" "Yes, sir. Your father's prepared to testify about the pressure Calhoun applied to him in the period before the fire." "My father has been waiting 20 years for someone to ask him to," Ethan said. Price set the papers down. He looked at both of them for a moment with the expression of a man running through the possible angles and finding them. Apparently, insufficient to explain away what he was looking at. "The property freeze," he said. "You understand what you're asking. If I sign this order and Calhoun's lawyers challenge it and the underlying fraud claim doesn't hold up in court, it'll hold up," Clara said. Price looked at her. "My mother was a methodical woman." "Your Honor," Clara said. "She didn't file anything she wasn't certain of. Every citation in those documents checks out. I went through them with Frank Abilene line by line. The land transfers are recorded. The false boundary claims are registered. The promissory note has Calhoun's signature on it and 2 witnesses who can be traced even if they're no longer in the county. The case your court will see is the case my mother built. and she built it to be unassailable, because she knew she might not be there to argue it herself. The room was quiet. Price picked up his pen. He signed the freeze order. Then he looked up and said, "The hearing will be scheduled within 3 weeks. I'd recommend your lawyer have every witness prepared and every document indexed before they walk into my court. I have no patience for disorganization when the stakes are this high." "Yes," Clara said. "Neither do I." They rode back through the night. There was no other choice. The freeze order needed to be in Frank Abilene's hands before Calhoun could move anything. And the window between Price signing and the news reaching Red Hollow through whatever channels Calhoun maintained was narrow. They pushed hard, trading rest for speed, and they arrived at the Bennett Ranch in the gray pre-dawn of the following morning with the horses exhausted and themselves not far behind. Thomas was awake. He came out before they'd fully stopped. Clara handed him the signed order from the saddle without dismounting. He looked at it for 5 seconds. "Done," he said. "Done," Clara said. Thomas looked at the order one more time. Then he looked at Ethan. "Get some rest," he said. "Both of you. What comes next is going to need you clear-headed." What came next was 3 weeks that moved with the particular compressed entity of time that has a fixed destination. Frank Abilene worked with the focused single-mindedness of a lawyer who understood that he was trying the most important case of his career. And he prepared accordingly. He met with Walter Grayson twice more, refining his testimony until every word of it was precise and unassailable. He arranged for James Hawthorne to give his account, and he spent a full afternoon with James going through it. And Clara heard afterward from Ethan that his father had come home from that session quieter than he'd been in years, not burdened quiet, but the quiet of a man who has finally put something down. Dale Calhoun learned about the freeze order 2 days after it was filed. Clara knew he'd learned because Red Hollow changed. It was subtle, not the dramatic, visible change of a confrontation, but the kind that moved through a small town the way a change of weather moved through water. Pressure adjusting, people who'd been easy suddenly careful. Men who'd done business with Calhoun finding reasons to be elsewhere when his name came up. Word traveled, it always did. Calhoun himself sent no message to the Bennetts or the Hawthorns. He sent no message to Frank Abilene. He did exactly what Ethan had predicted he would do. He tried to run. And the freeze order stopped him cold at the county line when the territorial marshal enforced it, which was the second moment in those 3 weeks that Clara felt the specific satisfaction of her mother's work proving itself. The first moment had been when she'd stood in the bank and read the sworn statement for the second time, alone, early in the morning before anyone else was there. "I trust that whoever finds this will do what I was not able to finish." She'd said it again then quietly, in the empty bank room. She was finishing it, Mama. She was finishing it. The morning of the hearing. The Bennett Ranch was up before dawn. Thomas dressed in his good jacket, the one he wore to church and to significant occasions. And he came downstairs with his hair combed and his jaw shaved, and the particular expression of a man who has decided he is going to conduct himself with dignity, regardless of what the day asks of him. Clara was already at the table with coffee and the final organized copies of everything Frank needed. Each document in the exact order they'd agreed on. Her father looked at the stack of papers. He looked at her. "Your mother would be," he stopped, started again. "She'd be very proud. She always said you were the one who'd finish things. She said I was either going to be extraordinary or impossible," Clara said. "Both," Thomas said. She said both, and for the first time in as long as Clara could remember. Her father smiled with something that reached all the way to his eyes. They rode to Red Hollow together. The Hawthorns were already there when they arrived, James and Ethan, waiting outside Frank Abilene's office with the quiet steadiness of men who'd made their peace with what the day held. James Hawthorne looked at Thomas Bennett across the distance between them, and he nodded once. And Thomas nodded back, and that was the complete language of it, 2 men who had said what needed saying and were now prepared to stand in the same direction. The territorial court convened in Red Hollow's largest building, which was the meeting hall, because the regular courthouse didn't have the room. It filled faster than Clara had expected. She'd underestimated how much of the valley had been following the word of the ranchers who'd sold land under pressure during hard winters. The families who'd watched Calhoun's holdings grow without understanding the mechanism. The people who'd lived beside the Bennett-Hawthorne feud for 20 years without knowing what it was built on. They came. Frank Abilene presented the case the way he'd prepared it, methodical, precise, structured around Margaret Bennett's original documents with the witness testimonies layered on top, in an order that built the picture piece by piece until the whole of it was visible and unavoidable. He was good at his work. Clara watched Judge Price's face while Frank spoke, and she could read the quality of a man paying serious attention. The particular focus of a judge who is following an argument and finding it sound. Walter Grayson testified first. He walked to the front of that full meeting hall, and he told the truth. All of it. His voice broke twice, and he steadied himself both times and kept going. Because whatever else Walter Grayson was, he was completing the thing he'd come to do, and he was not going to stop short of it. When he was finished, the room was very quiet in the way that rooms went quiet when something true had just been said in front of people who hadn't known it. James Hawthorne testified second. He was more composed than Clara had expected, the composure of a man who had rehearsed this, not in the legal sense, but in the private sense, who had been telling this story in his own head for 20 years and was now finally being asked to say it out loud, where it could do something. He described the original business arrangement with Calhoun. He described the moment he'd understood what was being built. He described writing to Margaret Bennett because she was the only person he could think of who might be positioned to stop it. He described the fire and the aftermath and the choice he'd made to stay silent because he believed wrongly. He said, with the directness of a man owning a thing fully, that silence would protect people who couldn't protect themselves. He described every morning of the 20 years after. Carrying it. When he was done, Thomas Bennett was looking at him from across the room. James Hawthorne looked back. Neither of them looked away. Clara testified last, because Frank had structured it that way, deliberately saving her for last, because her testimony was the one that connected all of it. The thread that ran from her mother's locked box through the county archive, through Bitter Creek, through Casper, and back to this room. She walked to the front of the meeting hall, and she looked at Judge Price, and she told the story plain. The way her father had always told her to tell things, when they mattered, no decoration. No detour, just the facts in the order they happened, and the evidence to support each one. She held her mother's original sworn statement in her hand while she spoke. She didn't read from it. She knew it by memory now, had known it. Really, from the first time she'd read it in the bank's back room. The words going into her the way her mother's voice had gone into her when she was small, and Margaret Bennett talked about the importance of finishing what you started. When she finished, Frank said quietly, "No further witnesses." "Your Honor." Price looked at Calhoun's lawyer, a man from Cheyenne who had the expression of someone who had arrived expecting a different fight and was still adjusting to the one he'd found. The lawyer raised several procedural objections, all of which Price addressed with brief, specific responses that left no room for further argument. He asked several questions of his own, pointed, precise. The questions of a man who has been paying close attention and wants the record to be complete. Then he called a recess of 1 hour. The meeting hall exhaled. Clara stepped outside with Ethan and her father and James Hawthorne. And they stood in the morning air of Red Hollow, and nobody said very much, because there was nothing useful to say in the interval between doing the thing and finding out if it worked. Thomas Bennett stood beside James Hawthorne. At one point, James said she was something. "You're Margaret, I know it," Thomas said. "I think about her still, what she was trying to do. She would have done it too," Thomas said, "if she'd had the time." He paused. She ran out of time, but she didn't run out of he stopped. She built it to last. That's what she did. She built it to last and she trusted it to someone to finish. He looked at Clara when he said this last part. Clara held his gaze. The hour passed. They went back inside. Judge Price returned and took his seat and looked out at the full meeting hall with the expression of a man who is about to say something that will have consequences and has made his peace with that. He spoke for 11 minutes. Clara counted, not because the time mattered, but because she needed something to do with the part of her that was too tightly wound to simply sit and receive what was happening. He laid out the legal findings. He cited the documents. He named the specific statutes under territorial law that Calhoun had violated. He addressed the property transfers each one and designated them subject to review and potential reversal pending the full investigation his ruling was now initiating. He found for the plaintiffs on every count. He ordered Dale Calhoun remanded to the custody of the territorial marshal pending formal charges. He ordered a full audit of every land transaction in the Powder River Valley involving Calhoun's interests going back 15 years. He commended the original work of, and here he paused and looked at his notes, making sure he had the name exactly right, Margaret Claire Bennett, whose meticulous documentation he described as the foundation upon which the entire case had been built. The meeting hall did not erupt. It did something quieter than that, a collective exhale. A release of pressure that had been building for a very long time. The particular sound of a community learning that the ground they'd been standing on had been falsified and was now being corrected. Clara did not cry. She was her mother's daughter and she had work still to do, and she did not cry. But she closed her eyes for one moment and she held her mother's sworn statement against her chest, and she said, inside herself, in the private space where the things that mattered most lived, "Done, Mama. It's done." Dale Calhoun was walked out of the meeting hall by the territorial marshal with expression of a man who had calculated wrong and knew it and was already calculating the next thing. Which was the expression, Clara thought, of a man who would spend whatever time remained to him calculating and never understanding that the calculating was the whole problem. She watched him go without satisfaction and without pity. She turned away before he was out of sight. The weeks that followed had the quality of ground after rain, everything settling into a new shape. The landscape the same but different, the contours altered by what had moved through. The formal investigation proceeded the way formal investigations in territorial courts proceeded slowly, thoroughly, with the particular institutional momentum of a process that has been properly set in motion and cannot easily be stopped. 3 of the land transactions Calhoun had engineered were reversed outright. 2 of the families who'd sold under pressure got parcels back. The rest of the audit was ongoing, but the direction of it was clear. Walter Grayson sold his ranch and left the valley before winter. He came to say goodbye to Thomas Bennett, and Thomas received him in the yard, not in the house. Not at the table, but in the yard, and the conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Clara didn't hear what was said. She saw her father's face after Walter rode away. And she left it alone, because some things between men of that generation existed in a space she wasn't meant to enter. Thomas Bennett turned to the ranch with something Clara hadn't seen from him in years' full attention. Not the divided attention of a man whose grief was claiming half his energy, but the real, practical, forward-looking focus of a man who had put something down and freed his hands for the work in front of him. He rebuilt the section of east fence himself, the one with the 2 soft posts that Clara had been riding out to repair when she'd found Ethan in the grass. Ethan helped him. Clara watched them work from a distance one afternoon, her father and Ethan Hawthorne. 2 men who had come to this fence line from opposite directions and arrived at the same task, and she thought about the way some things didn't need to be declared or announced. They just became true through the accumulation of practical acts. Her father handed Ethan a tool, and Ethan used it and handed it back, and they moved down the fence line together, and the work got done. The orchard Clara started in October. She'd been right about which trees were worth saving and which had gone too far. She walked the rows in the first week and made her assessments, and began with the ones her mother had planted first. The oldest trees, the ones with the most history in their bark and branches. She pruned and cleared and staked and fed, and the work was slow and physical and deeply completely satisfying in the way that the best work was. The kind that asked everything of your hands and left your mind free to be somewhere simpler. Ethan worked beside her more days than not. He'd taken a room in Red Hollow temporarily, giving Thomas Bennett the space a man needed when he was still learning to see something new in territory he'd occupied for 30 years. But he was at the Bennett Ranch most days working, helping, present in the practical way that had been his most consistent characteristic from the beginning. He didn't push, he didn't rush. He understood, without it needing to be said, that some things took the time they took. One afternoon in late October, working at the far end of the orchard row, he said, "My father wants to take down the fence." Clara looked up. "Which fence?" "The boundary line, between our land and yours." He kept working while he talked, pruning shears in his right hand. Left arm mostly healed now, the shoulder still careful but functional. He says it was always an artificial line anyway, that the creek is the natural boundary, and the fence was put up during the bad years as a statement, and the statement is done now. Clara was quiet for a moment. "What do you think?" "I think he's right," Ethan said. "I think a fence that was built to keep enemies separate doesn't serve much purpose when there aren't enemies anymore." Clara looked at the row of apple trees in front of her, her mother's trees, brought back from 10 years of wildness, beginning to show the shape they'd always been meant to have. "My father's going to want to think about it," she said. "He doesn't make changes to the land fast." "I know it," Ethan said. "I'm not in a hurry." She looked at him then, this man who had come back to a valley that had shot him for asking questions, who had said "yes, ma'am" on the second morning and meant it, who rehung doors one-handed and brought coffee without being asked and had sat in a barn rather than accept a room he hadn't earned yet, who had ridden to Casper through the night and stood in a tutorial courthouse, and who had said to her, on the road back, simply, "We're going to make it count." "You're not in a hurry about most things," she said. "I'm in a hurry about a few," he said. He was looking at her when he said it. Not obliquely, directly, the way he said everything, with the plainness of a man who had decided. Clara set down her pruning shears. "Ethan Hawthorne," she said, "if you've got something to say to me, say it plain. I love you." He's simple, direct. No preamble and no hedging. "I've known it since Bitter Creek. Maybe before. I'm not asking you to do anything about it today. I'm asking you to know it. Because you deserve to know that the man working beside you in your mother's orchard is not here because of a feud or a legal case or a family debt. He's here because of you." The orchard was very quiet around them. The October light was the particular gold of late season, the kind that made everything it touched look more itself. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I've known it since the cabin, since the second morning, when you said 'yes, ma'am' and lay back down because I told you to, and I understood I understood what that was." He looked at her steadily. "What do you want to do about it?" "I want to finish the orchard," Clara said. "And I want to see my father and your father take down that fence together. And I want one full season of ordinary problems on a working ranch." She paused. "And then I want to build something with you." Ethan Hawthorne looked at her. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They went back to work. The spring came early to the Powder River Valley that year, which the old ranchers said was a sign, and the young ranchers said was just weather, and both of them were probably right in their own way. The creek ran high and strong, the grass came back thick in the east section, and the apple orchard showed new growth on every tree that Clara had saved, small and definite, and full of the particular insistence of living things that have been properly tended after a long time of being left to themselves. Thomas Bennett and James Hawthorne took the boundary fence down on a Tuesday in April. They did it together, the two of them, with Ethan and Clara working the far posts, and the four of them moving down the line in the mild spring morning, pulling stakes and rolling wire and dismantling what had been built in anger, piece by piece. Nobody made a speech. Thomas had brought coffee in a thermos, and he poured 4 cups and handed them around without ceremony. And James Hawthorne accepted his and drank it, and the 4 of them stood in the space where the fence had been and looked at the uninterrupted land running to the creek in both directions. Margaret always said the creek was the right line, Thomas said. She was right, James said. That was all. The wedding happened in late September. At the end of the row of apple trees that Clara had restored through the winter and spring. Her father stood beside her. James Hawthorne stood beside Ethan. Frank Abilene was there, and Horace Delp from the county archive. And a dozen people from Red Hollow who had watched 2 families come apart and come back together and had understood. In the watching, something about the nature of inherited pain and what it took to stop passing it forward. Thomas Bennett walked his daughter to where Ethan stood waiting. And he stopped and looked at this man who had come back to a valley that had tried to kill him, who had asked questions that nobody wanted answered and kept asking them until the answers were found, who had sat in a cabin with a bullet wound and said yes ma'am to his daughter and meant it, who had stood in a bank in Casper and told a judge that his father would testify and had been right. Thomas put Clara's hand in Ethan's. He held them both, briefly with both of his. Then he stepped back. The late September light came gold through the apple trees. The same light that had been coming through those trees for as long as Clara could remember. But different now, unobstructed, reaching all the way to the ground the way light reached ground when nothing was blocking it. Ethan looked at Clara. Clara looked at Ethan. And somewhere between the 2 of them, in the space where a feud had been and wasn't anymore, in the valley that had cost 2 families 20 years and was now giving them back what remained a beginning. A cleared field, ground that had been tested and found solid. Margaret Bennett's orchard bloomed late into the season and held its fruit long past when fruit had any business holding. As if the trees themselves understood that some things, once properly tended, refused to let go until they were ready. Clara Bennett had pulled a bleeding stranger from the grass beside her fence, because leaving a man to die was not something you walked away from and still knew who you were. She had not known his name. She had not known his brand would change everything. She had not known that the knife she'd driven into the fence post to steady her own hands would mark the place where 20 years of wrong direction finally turned toward true. But she knew now. And the woman who had been raised to fear a name chose instead to learn the man who carried it and in so finished the work her mother had started, freed her father from the grief that had imprisoned him, and built something on the actual earth that no false story could shake loose. Some wounds could not heal while people kept them open. Some fences only existed because someone needed enemies on the other side. And some strangers, bleeding in the grass beside your fence, were not the danger your fear told you they were. Sometimes, if you were brave enough to kneel down instead of right away, they were the ones who helped you finally, after everything, come home.